1760 to 1829, a woman infamous in American history for her involvement in kidnapping, enslaving, and murdering free African Americans. The narrative you are about to read combines documented history with fictionalized dramatization to create an immersive horror storytelling experience. Some events are expanded or reimagined for atmosphere, but the cruelty and violence depicted are rooted in historical realities of slavery and racial violence in 19th century America. This story contains graphic themes of murder, enslavement, racial terror, and psychological horror. It is intended for mature audiences only. The purpose of this narrative is to explore the darkness of human cruelty, not to glorify it. The year was 1760, deep in the marshy borderlands of Maryland and Delaware. The land smelled of salt and iron, with swamps that whispered at night, and fields where enslaved men and women bent their backs beneath the cruel sun. It was into this soil, heavy with blood and fear, that Patty Cannon was born. Even as a child, neighbors whispered she was different. Her eyes, a pale gray, seemed to look straight through people. She laughed not at joy, but at pain, at a dog being beaten, at a bird with a broken wing. Some said the devil himself had marked her, that she had been born under an unlucky star. Her family lived poor, rough lives, farmers and tavern keepers struggling against debt. Her father drank, her mother prayed, but neither could soften the wild cruelty that lived in their daughter. She grew fast, strong for her age, and with a temper that burned hot and sudden. By the age of 12, she had already struck another child with a stone so hard the boy never walked right again. But in colonial America, brutality was not rare. Violence was a language spoken daily, between masters and slaves, husbands and wives, neighbors over land. Patty simply spoke it more fluently than most. The borderland between Maryland and Delaware was a place of contradictions. Fertile fields stretched wide, but they were worked by hands that did not own them. Small towns bustled with taverns, markets, and gossip, but behind every cheerful exchange lurked fear of debt, disease, or disgrace. Children grew fast here, hardened by hunger, labor, and brutality. Patty Cannon grew up absorbing cruelty as if it were milk. Her father, a man of coarse temper, worked the soil but drank away most profits. When drunk, he beat his wife and cursed his children. Her mother, once gentle, grew bitter and silent. Patty learned early that power belonged to those who struck first and hardest. There were stories neighbors told in hushed tones, stories that clung to Patty like smoke. How she drowned kittens in the trough while laughing. How she set snares not just for rabbits, but for children she disliked. How she once dragged a younger boy into the woods, tied him to a tree, and left him there until nightfall, when his screams carried all the way back to town. And when confronted, Patty never apologized. She looked her accusers in the eye with a cold, steady stare, as if daring them to challenge her. By adolescence, she had grown into a stout, muscular girl, broader in the shoulders than many boys her age. Her hands were rough, her jaw set strong, her voice louder than most men's. She was not considered beautiful, but there was a force to her presence, an intimidation that made others give way. Marriage and early reputation at 16, Patty married Jesse Cannon, a man older than her, but already ruined by gambling and drink. Some said Patty chose him because he was weak, easy to command, easy to bend. The marriage was violent. Fights between them could be heard across the fields. Jesse would try to assert himself, only to end up beaten, cut, or humiliated by his wife's sharp tongue and fists. The community whispered about the Cannon household, calling it a den of chaos. But it was not only her husband who suffered. Neighbors noticed slaves and free black workers who went near Patty's property often disappeared, never seen again. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence. After all, fugitives often fled north, chasing rumors of safety. But deep down, suspicion stirred. Seeds of hatred by the 1790s, the Eastern Shore was caught in the cruel economy of slavery. Maryland and Delaware sat at the border of North and South. Here, freedom was uncertain, fragile, easily stolen. Free African Americans lived in constant fear of being seized by kidnappers and sold south, where plantations stretched for miles and escape was nearly impossible. Patty Cannon watched this system with a predator's eyes. She saw not human lives, but opportunity. Each person stolen, each child snatched from their bed, was coin in her pocket. Neighbors recalled how she would speak with venom about African Americans, both enslaved and free. Her words dripped with hatred, but beneath the hatred was greed. She believed herself entitled to profit from their suffering. First killings, the first confirmed whispers of murder, came around the turn of the century. A young black boy, about 10 years old, was last seen near the Cannon farm. His parents searched, neighbors searched, but Patty claimed ignorance. Weeks later, a farmhand claimed to have seen bones unearthed by wild dogs near her property. No one dared confront her directly. Then, an older woman, one who had worked cleaning her house, vanished. Again, Patty feigned ignorance. But those who knew her swore she smiled when their names were mentioned, a thin, chilling smile that never reached her eyes. It was said that Patty learned quickly that murder silenced witnesses. And silence, to her, was worth more than gold. Building a reputation by the early 1800s, Patty Cannon was known across several counties, not as a woman to be admired, but as a woman to be feared. Men at taverns lowered their voices when her name came up. Children were warned to stay away from her property. And yet, there are those who admired her ruthlessness, who saw in her a kind of power that women rarely wielded in those times. She learned to use fear as a shield. When disputes arose, she glared and shouted until the other side backed down. When a law sniffed near her property, she bribed, threatened, or mocked them into retreat. And in the shadows, she was already plotting the foundation of something far larger than petty cruelty. She would gather others like her, men who wanted money, who cared nothing for mercy, and together they would create a gang whose very name would terrify generations. The Cannon-Johnson Gang. The early 1800s brought restless change to the borderland. News from Philadelphia spoke of abolitionists gaining ground. In the South, demand for enslaved labor only grew hungrier, with cotton fields spreading wider each year. This borderland, neither fully north nor south, became a hunting ground. Free black families, though technically safe under law, were never truly safe. Papers could be forged, testimony bought, judges bribed. And into this murky world stepped Patty Cannon, already hardened, already cruel, and now beginning to organize her violence into profit. She started small. A boy left alone on the road, a woman lured with promises of work, a family betrayed by neighbors. These disappearances went largely unnoticed, lost in the larger chaos of a divided America. But each one made her bolder. First Alliance's Patty's first ally was her own son-in-law, Joe Johnson, a sly man with a gambler's smile and a killer's instincts. Johnson had a knack for lies. He could convince a free man he was wanted for debt, trick him into chains, and sell him across the South before anyone noticed he was gone. Patty and Joe understood each other. Where he was cunning, she was brutal. Where he deceived, she enforced. Together, they became more than predators. They became architects of a trade in stolen lives. Soon others joined, drifters, debtors, men with grudges against the law. The Cannon property became a meeting place, a tavern by day, a den of conspiracies by night. The House of Chains, its first victim's Patty's farmhouse, stood on a patch of land ringed by trees. At a glance, it looked ordinary, smoke curling from the chimney, chickens scratching in the yard. But inside, the walls carried secrets. Beneath the floorboards, chains were bolted. In the attic, iron collars lay in shadow. Locals would later swear they heard muffled cries at night, though none dared investigate. Travelers who stopped for drink sometimes left without a trace. One chilling tale told of a young woman, light-skinned and free, who stopped at the Cannon Tavern seeking shelter on her way north. Patty welcomed her with food and drink, smiling kindly. By morning, the girl was gone, her belongings sold in town, and her name never spoken again. It was here that Patty discovered her true power, control through terror. Once captured, her victims rarely escaped, and once silenced, their families rarely found justice. The reputation grows by now. Whispers about Patty Cannon had grown louder. Some called her a witch, others the devil's bride. Parents frightened their children into obedience by threatening, "Behave, or Patty Cannon will come for you." But others, lawmen, landowners, slave traders, saw in her a tool. She provided bodies for the southern markets, no questions asked. She dealt in flesh like others dealt in grain or tobacco. And the profit was undeniable. The silence of the community became her shield. Neighbors might whisper, but they did not act. Judges might suspect, but they did not charge. Fear of her wrath kept many mouths closed. Escalation into murder kidnapping was profitable, but murder was necessary. Witnesses were dangerous. Runaways, if they made it north, could testify. So Patty learned the value of shallow grave. She did not always kill in rage. Often, she killed as one might swat a fly, calm, deliberate, almost bored. A child who cried too loudly, a man who resisted too fiercely, a woman who threatened to speak. Their bodies were dumped in fields, rivers, and even her own orchard. By the mid-1810s, Patty Cannon's property had become known among locals as the House of Chains. Huss, the child once feared for drowning kittens, had become a woman feared across counties. No longer just cruel, no longer just violent, Patty Cannon had become a system, a one-woman empire of terror feeding off the vulnerability of her black neighbors. And yet, her true reign of horror had only begun. The shadows she cast would soon stretch beyond her farm, across Maryland and Delaware, and into the very heart of America's slave trade. By 1810, the Cannon farm was no longer just a family property. It was a headquarters. Her son-in-law, Joe Johnson, quick with lies and quicker with violence, stood at her side. Together, they realized that petty cruelty was small compared to what could be earned by turning the system of slavery into their own private industry. America was split by slavery's shadow. In the South, plantations craved labor. In the North, abolitionists fought for freedom. But the borderland between Maryland and Delaware was lawless ground, a place where free black men and women lived in constant fear of being stolen. Patty Cannon saw this fear not as tragedy, but as opportunity. So she began to recruit. The first were drifters, men who had nothing, who drank hard and fought harder. Then came slave catchers, already used to hunting runaways. Finally, petty criminals and debtors joined, drawn by the promise of quick money. By the time the gang was fully formed, it numbered nearly 24 men, all answering to Patty Cannon. And though Joe Johnson handled much of the day-to-day trickery, everyone knew Patty was the true leader. Their methods, the Cannon Johnson gang, thrived through deception, violence, and corruption. Their methods were precise. Kidnapping. They lured free black men with offers of work or ambushed travelers on lonely roads. Forgery. They created false ownership papers, claiming their victims were escaped slaves. Transport. Victims were shackled and hidden in wagons, carried south in chains. Sale. Once across state lines, they were sold in markets like livestock, disappearing forever into the deep south. For every victim, Patty's pockets filled. For every witness, there was silence, purchased with coin or forced at the edge of a knife. The farm as a fortress, the Cannon farmhouse grew infamous as the gang's stronghold. What looked like a humble home on the outside was within a prison. Iron shackles were bolted to the floors of hidden rooms. Cellars smelled of sweat, blood, and despair. Attics became cages, filled with the muffled cries of children torn from their parents. Survivors would later describe nights when the air vibrated with screams and rattling chains. But the neighbors, out of fear or complicity, remained silent. A woman among killers, what shocked people most was not just that the gang existed, but that a woman commanded it. In an era when women were expected to be quiet, obedient, and domestic, Patty Cannon defied every role. She shouted orders, brandished weapons, and killed with her own hands. Men twice her size obeyed her, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Some said her presence was worse than any man's, For where men killed with drunken rage, she killed with a chilling calm. Survivors recalled her gray eyes watching without emotion as people were beaten, chained, or dragged into wagons. She was not only feared by her victims, her gang feared her too. First blood on the roads. The gang's rise was marked by violence on the highways. Caravans of chained captives became a common sight, hurried along dusty backroads toward the south. But not every victim went quietly. There were fights, men and women who resisted, children who tried to flee. When resistance came, it was met with brutality. One man, a free black farmer, was beaten so badly on the roadside that even the gang's horses shied away from the blood. A child who screamed too long was thrown into a ditch and left behind. A woman who slashed at Joe Johnson with a hidden blade was killed by Patty herself, her body buried under orchard soil. Each act of violence was meant as a message. Resistance was futile. The web of corruption, no empire of crime, survives without protection, and Patty Cannon bought hers well. Local sheriffs, often poor and desperate, were bribed into silence. Judges looked the other way when ownership papers were presented, even when the papers were obvious forgeries. Slave traders down south welcomed the new supply, no questions asked. It was said that for every coin Patty earned in blood, a smaller coin found its way into a sheriff's pocket, a judge's drawer, or a tavern owner's hand. And so the gang thrived, a spider's web across counties, with Patty Cannon at its dark center. The fear spreads by the mid-1810s. The name Cannon had become a curse whispered in the black communities of Delaware and Maryland. Families lived in terror of nightfall, when shadows could mean kidnappers. Children were warned not to wander. Men traveled in groups, armed, yet still vulnerable. Survivors told stories of wagons passing under moonlight, filled with chained men and women, guarded by men with pistols and whips. And at the head of it all was Patty Cannon, the woman who hunted her neighbors. But whispers were beginning to turn into resistance. By 1815, the Cannon-Johnson gang had perfected their operation. They no longer acted like mere criminals, but like a business enterprise of terror. Their routes stretched from Delaware marshlands to the hidden backroads of Maryland. Joe Johnson forged papers declaring that free black men were runaways. Patty provided muscle and command. Their gang of hired ruffians carried pistols, clubs, and ropes. Once a victim was seized, their fate was sealed. Families begged for help, but the law was slow, indifferent, or corrupt. More often than not, those taken by Patty Cannon's gang vanished forever into the cotton fields of the Deep South. The night of the orchard graves, locals whispered of a night when Patty, enraged that two captives had tried to escape, led her men into the orchard behind her house. By lantern light, she ordered shallow pits dug beneath the apple trees. The two victims, a man in his 30s and a boy barely 12, were dragged out in chains. Witnesses later claimed Patty struck the man herself with a club until he collapsed, then ordered the boy strangled with a rope. Their bodies were buried beneath the orchard, where fruit would grow sweet in soil fed by blood. This story spread like wildfire, though no one dared confront her. The orchard stood as a silent warning. Defy Patty Cannon, and you vanish into the earth. The disappearance of the Hill family, one of the most infamous crimes tied to the Cannon-Johnson gang, was the disappearance of the Hill family, a free black household living near the Maryland border. The father, Samuel Hill, was a carpenter known for his skill. His wife, Rebecca, was a midwife who helped both black and white families. They had 3 children, ages 14, 10, and 7. One autumn night, their cabin was found empty. Dishes lay on the table, a fire still smoldering in the hearth. Neighbors searched, but no sign of the family was found. Rumors soon spread that they had been seized by Patty's gang, dragged from their beds, and shackled in her farmhouse before being sold south. The disappearance sent waves of terror through the region. If an entire family could vanish without a trace, no one was safe. The Tavern of Fear Patty's tavern became infamous in its own right. To outsiders, it was a place of ale and rough company. But to those who knew, it was a trap. Travelers, particularly free black men looking for work, were lured inside with promises of cheap drink or food. Once drunk or distracted, they were overpowered, bound, and hidden in cellars until the next transport wagon came. Locals who passed by at night swore they heard faint cries carried on the wind. Yet no one dared enter. The tavern was the domain of Patty Cannon, the woman untouchable by law. Escalation into systematic murder by now. Kidnapping alone was not enough. The gang killed freely, not just to silence victims, but to maintain dominance. Witnesses who threatened to speak were found dead in rivers. Rivals in crime who challenged her were poisoned or shot. Children too small to survive the journey south were quietly buried. Patty Cannon herself seemed to grow colder with each death. Where once she had killed in fits of rage, now she killed with methodical calm. Some claimed she even smiled while watching others carry out executions. Power and paranoia. With power came paranoia. Patty trusted no one fully, not even Joe Johnson. She demanded absolute obedience from her men, threatening them with the same fate as her captives if they faltered. Her farmhouse was fortified. Guns were kept loaded, dogs trained to attack strangers, and secret hiding places built for chains, papers, and money. She ruled her gang like a queen of shadows, feared by all under her command. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Greed bred resentment. Brutality bred whispers of betrayal. And beyond the swamps and orchards, voices of resistance were beginning to rise. By the end of the 1810s, the Cannon-Johnson gang was no longer just a group of criminals. It was a network of kidnappers, killers, and traitors feared across 3 states. Families prayed to avoid their path. Communities whispered of their horrors. And Patty Cannon, the woman at its helm, was becoming a legend of terror. But legends, no matter how dark, eventually draw light. And the more her crimes spread, the closer her enemies came. This section takes us inside Patty Cannon's farmhouse prison, showing how it became a symbol of dread. Here, victims were held, broken, and often killed. Survivor accounts, folklore, and whispered rumors will bring the horror to life. A house that breathed fear from the outside, the Cannon farmhouse seemed unremarkable. A 2-story frame house with smoke curling from its chimney, a well in the yard, and an orchard stretching behind. To neighbors, it was simply another rough tavern where men gathered to drink and brawl. But to those who crossed its threshold and never returned, it was a house of chains. Every wall seemed to hold secrets. Beneath loose floorboards, shackles were bolted into the beams. In the attic, collars and manacles rusted in piles. The cellars smelled of damp earth, urine, and despair. Doors creaked not with age, but under the weight of those locked behind them. Survivors later said the very air inside seemed heavy, as if the house itself remembered every cry. The hidden prisoners' victims were often hidden in cellars, attics, and barns for days or weeks before transport. Families torn from their homes were crammed into dark corners, shackled to prevent escape. Children sobbed until exhaustion silenced them. Mothers clutched them close, whispering comfort they did not believe. Men rattled chains until their wrists bled, but no help ever came. And above them, life went on. Tavern laughter, boots stomping on the floorboards, Patty Cannon's booming voice giving orders. The horror of the prisoners was drowned beneath the ordinary noise of drink and business. The sound of iron neighbors who lived close swore they sometimes heard iron rattling at night, carried across fields by the wind. Others spoke of faint cries that rose above the orchard. But when asked directly, they denied it. Fear kept mouths shut. For those who dared even to suspect, there was always the same thought. What if Patty finds out I know? Better to say nothing. Better to pretend the house was normal. Survivors' whispers, though many were never seen again. A few escaped Patty's clutches. Their stories would later become chilling testimony. One man, chained in the cellar for 3 weeks, recalled rats gnawing at his ankles while Patty laughed at his screams. A teenage girl claimed Patty burned her arm with hot iron as punishment for praying aloud. Another survivor described how Patty would come into the cellar with a lantern, hold it close to their faces, and whisper No one is coming for you. You are mine. These accounts blurred the line between truth and nightmare. But all agreed on one point. Patty Cannon was no ordinary criminal. She seemed to enjoy suffering. Rumors of torture while hard evidence was scarce. Rumors painted a picture even darker than fact. Some claimed Patty experimented with poisons, slipping them into food to test their effects. Others swore she starved captives, watching them grow weaker day by day before deciding their fate. A few whispered she killed children outright, knowing they were too small to survive the southern plantations. Folklore added its own embellishments, stories of ghosts seen near the orchard, of shadows moving behind attic windows, of screams that never faded. Whether true or not, these tales cemented the farmhouse's reputation as a haunted place of the living and the dead. The mask of respectability, what made the horror worse, was how easily Patty shifted between roles. To strangers, she could play the part of a tavern hostess, offering ale and bread with a smile. To neighbors, she was loud, intimidating, but still just a woman. But when the doors were closed and her victims chained, her mask slipped. Then, she was the warden of her own hell, ruling through cruelty and iron. The unholy silence by the late 1810s, the Cannon property had become infamous. People avoided passing it at night. Travelers hurried by, eyes fixed on the road. Yet no one reported her, no one challenged her. The silence of the community became her greatest weapon. Each missing person became another secret buried in silence. Each scream ignored was another stone in the foundation of her reign. The farmhouse did not just hold prisoners. It held the complicity of a society that allowed it to exist. The House of Chains was not just a building. It was a symbol of the terror Patty Cannon cast over the borderlands. Every wall soaked in fear, every floorboard echoing with chains, every silence outside testifying to a community too afraid to act. And as the years passed, her cruelty only deepened. Soon, her reign would stretch beyond her farmhouse and into the broader countryside, making her not just a local terror, but a legend of American evil. Patty Cannon's death in 1829 did not mark the end of her reign of terror. It was merely the end of her physical existence. What remained was something far more chilling: the deep stain of her deeds upon American memory, law, and culture. The dark legacy of Patty Cannon continues to echo through history, not only as a story of individual cruelty, but also as a stark reminder of systemic violence and moral failure in early America. 1. Immediate aftermath of her arrest and death. When Patty Cannon was arrested and placed into custody, public curiosity and fear reached a fever pitch. Newspapers eagerly covered her downfall, describing her both as a hardened criminal and as a grotesque symbol of human depravity. By the time she allegedly took her own life in her jail cell, or, as some accounts claimed, succumbed to illness, her story had become legend. The brutality of her crimes was so extreme that even in an era when violence was commonplace, she stood out as a figure of extraordinary infamy. The reactions of local communities were complex. For some, her capture was a relief, finally bringing safety to an area terrorized for decades. For others, there was shame that such atrocities had been allowed to thrive openly within their midst, facilitated by silence, complicity, and profit. The memory of her death lingered not only in official reports, but also in whispered tales around hearths and taverns, where she was often recast as a near-mythical monster. 2. The fear that lingered among the African-American community. For free black communities living near the Maryland-Delaware border, Patty Cannon's death brought no real sense of closure. Generations of families had lost members to her gang's kidnappings. Children were taken in the dead of night. Free men were shackled and marched south, and mothers disappeared without explanation. The fear that she and her gang instilled left deep psychological scars. Even after her death, the specter of abduction haunted African-American life in the region. Parents warned children never to travel alone. Communities organized protective networks, sharing information about suspicious movements and strangers. In oral histories passed down for decades, Patty Cannon became less of a historical figure and more of a cautionary tale, a personification of the dangers that lurked for those who lived without legal protections in a nation where slavery remained powerful and profitable. 3. The erosion of trust in local institutions. One of the most lasting consequences of Patty Cannon's crimes was the erosion of trust between marginalized communities and local authorities. Her ability to operate with near impunity for so long revealed the weaknesses or outright corruption of legal systems meant to protect the innocent. Law enforcement officials often turn a blind eye, and judges and sheriffs were frequently complicit. For many, the knowledge that white kidnappers could steal black lives with little fear of punishment underscored the systemic failures of the time. Cannon's crimes were not simply those of an individual. They were enabled by a society that valued profit over humanity. The legacy of that institutional betrayal would continue to haunt African Americans long after her death. 4. Transformation into folklore and myth. Over the years, Patty Cannon's story began to blur the line between history and folklore. Some described her as a witch who had made a pact with the devil, capable of disappearing into the woods or cursing those who crossed her. Others painted her as a kind of female demon, lurking in the swamps, waiting to drag victims into slavery. These tales were not merely sensational inventions. They were cultural responses to the trauma she inflicted. Communities used folklore to process the unspeakable horrors she committed, reshaping her into a figure larger than life, a monster whose evil transcended the ordinary. Even today, in certain parts of Delaware and Maryland, her name is invoked in ghost stories, and her house is rumored to be haunted ground. 5. Literary and historical accounts. Historians, journalists, and novelists have grappled with Patty Cannon's legacy for nearly 2 centuries. Early 19th century accounts sensationalized her life, often exaggerating or mythologizing details for dramatic effect. In the 20th century, she became the subject of both serious scholarship and lurid true crime writing. These accounts, however, often reflected the biases of their times. Some narratives sensationalized her violence while downplaying the racial dimensions of her crimes. Others recast her as a twisted anti-heroine, focusing more on her gender defiance than on the horror she inflicted on African Americans. In more recent years, scholarship has sought to recenter the victims, emphasizing that the true legacy of Patty Cannon is not her notoriety, but the suffering she caused. 6. Patty Cannon as a symbol of gender and power. Another element of her legacy is the way her story intersects with ideas about women, violence, and power. In early America, female criminals were often depicted as aberrations of nature, unfeminine, monstrous, and unnatural. Patty Cannon, with her brutality and leadership of a violent gang, shattered contemporary gender expectations. Her story forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about women and violence. She could not be dismissed simply as an accomplice or as a victim of circumstance. She was the architect of her own crimes, wielding authority with terrifying effectiveness. This made her both more shocking and more memorable, carving her into history as one of the few female figures associated with large-scale organized violence in early America. 7. Historical lessons. The dangers of complicity. Patty Cannon's legacy also serves as a lesson in the dangers of societal complicity. For decades, her crimes were an open secret. Local authorities profited, neighbors looked away, and entire communities normalized the abduction of black men, women, and children. The fact that her reign lasted so long is a testament not only to her cruelty, but also to the silence and apathy of those around her. Her story illustrates how injustice can thrive when people convince themselves that their silence absolves them of responsibility. In truth, it was this environment of tolerance and complicity that allowed her gang to flourish for so long. This uncomfortable legacy forces modern readers to reflect on the ways in which injustice persists today when people look away. 8. Her place in American history today. Patty Cannon remains both a historical figure and a haunting symbol. She represents the extremes of human cruelty, the vulnerability of marginalized communities, and the dangers of unchecked power. Her name may not be as widely known as other infamous figures, but within the region where she operated, her shadow remains long and dark. Her legacy is a reminder that history is not only about great leaders and noble causes. It is also about the criminals, the exploiters, and the systems of oppression that thrived in America's past. By remembering Patty Cannon, we are forced to confront the ugliest aspects of early American society, ensuring that the suffering of her victims is not forgotten. The final stretch of Patty Cannon's life was not filled with the riches, power, or control she had once wielded with such brutal authority. Instead, it was defined by betrayal, exposure, and the slow unraveling of a legacy built on cruelty and blood. The woman who had once orchestrated one of the most terrifying kidnapping rings in early America, targeting free black men, women, and children, was finally brought to her knees. By the late 1820s, rumors and stories of Patty Cannon's atrocities had spread beyond the tangled backwoods of the Delmarva Peninsula. Escaped survivors spoke of her. Abolitionists pointed toward her as an example of unchecked evil, and lawmen grew more determined to end her reign. The once impenetrable wall of silence that had surrounded her began to crack. Neighbors whispered about the shallow graves on her property, about children who were seen one day and gone the next, about screams heard at night. Fear slowly gave way to anger. The turning point came when human remains, skeletons of men, women, and children, were discovered on land connected to her household. The macabre evidence was undeniable. For years, whispers had swirled, but now bones told the story more truthfully than any human tongue could. Patty, by then old and weakened, could no longer deny the blood-soaked history that clung to her name. When she was arrested in 1829, it shocked the communities she had terrorized. To see the infamous Patty Cannon, a woman who had struck fear into the hearts of countless families, sitting behind bars seemed almost surreal. For decades, she had lived above the law, protected by corrupt allies and the silence of terrorized neighbors. Now, she was caged like the countless men, women, and children she had once chained and sold. Her trial was a spectacle. Newspapers carried the story, branding her as one of the most monstrous women in American history. Witnesses testified about kidnappings, illegal sales into slavery, and murders. Many claimed she personally killed those who resisted or threatened to expose her. The evidence was damning, yet there was a strange fascination with her, a woman, not a man, at the center of such horror. In a time when women were rarely seen as powerful, Patty's crime stood out as both uniquely brutal and shocking. She never faced execution. Before her sentence could be carried out, Patty Cannon died in prison, some claiming it was suicide by poison, others whispering that old age and illness claimed her. Either way, she died behind cold, iron bars, stripped of her power, her empire of terror dismantled. But her death did not end her story. The name Patty Cannon lingered like a ghost in American memory. Parents in Delaware and Maryland used her as a warning figure, a boogeyman to frighten children into obedience. Historians studied her case as an example of the dark underbelly of the early United States, where slavery, racism, and greed created fertile ground for predators like her to thrive. Her house, long since abandoned, was rumored to be haunted. Locals claimed to hear cries at night, whispers in the wind, and footsteps in empty rooms. In truth, Patty Cannon became something larger than a single woman. She became a symbol of America's original sin, the institution of slavery, the kidnapping of free black people, the brutal commodification of human lives. Her story, though horrifying, forced later generations to confront the question of how many lives were stolen, how many families shattered, and how much silence allowed such evil to thrive. Her fall was not just the end of a criminal empire. It was the unmasking of a system that permitted her rise in the first place. And though her bones turned to dust long ago, her shadow still lingers, a chilling reminder that beneath the surface of every society lies the potential for cruelty, waiting only for the silence of others to give it power. E3.